Okay, Matt, thank you for joining us. Could you just introduce yourself to everyone who's listening who may not know who you are?
Yeah, sure. Thanks for having me on, Ian. So my name's Matt Regan. I am a professor, an assistant professor of biology in the Department of Biological Sciences at the University of Montreal, or l'Université de Montréal, as we say around here. And so my research focuses on um, I'm an animal physiologist, and the broad scope of my research program looks at the mechanisms that certain specialized yet diverse animals use to induce and sustain states of depressed metabolism, which they can then recover from. An example being, probably the most well known example being hibernating mammals. But I also work, and I do work with hibernating mammals, but I also work with other animals that are capable of this metabolic feat, such as fishes, for example, that can survive prolonged periods with little to no oxygen. They do something similar to the hibernating mammals to allow them to survive that.
Yeah, so I first came across you because you had been a part of this research paper that went out and it got like a lot of attention, I think, as far as like most research papers don't really get that much attention. And there was articles going around the internet and I was fascinated by it to some degree because when I looked at it, I was kind of like, this might be like the mortar, like the groundwork, like foundations for like homeostasis in like space travel. But it was also interesting because if correct me anywhere I'm wrong here too, because I'm not like a professional, but uh, urea nitrogen salvage theory, it kind of solidified that theory in a way, right?
Yeah, well, it showed that it is a process that is definitely occurring in hibernating mammals. It's a process that has been known for many years to be active in other animals, particularly animals that have quite different like the architecture of their gastrointestinal systems. So, for
Yeah.
example, cows, like animals that belong to a group called the ruminants, which have quite different architectures to their GI tracts than the hibernating squirrels that we work with, which are similar GI tracts to what we have, humans have.
Yeah, and GI
Right?
tracts are quite a complex thing too. They're like a symphony of like different bacteria and all this other
They are.
stuff, right? Yeah.
Yeah, they are different tissues, different organs, all contributing to the same physiological system. And then, of course, you have even different kingdoms of life because you have cells from the host themselves, of course, that make up the tissues. But then you also have this hugely complex environment of microbial life, mainly bacteria, but also other microbial groups as well.
Yeah. Um, so when you speculate about the futures of where this research is going to lead, where do you see it going? Like, what are your hopes for it? What are your realistic, like in the near future? What are the realistic possibilities you see going forward with it, and stuff like that?
Yeah, it's a good question. So this is this first study that we've just published here is, I think, like the first. It's a proof of principle. Basically, it tested this hypothesis that had been floating around in the hibernation research community for like almost 30 years.
Yeah.
And for various reasons, we were able, over the past few years, to go in. It was about 3 years into making this study, and we were able to go in and use techniques that are sort of have entered our realm as hibernation researchers. By that I mean have become available enough, user friendly enough, and cheap enough that allow more labs around the world to use. And so we were able to show, like we were able to demonstrate clear evidence that this process of urea nitrogen salvage, which we can talk about for your listeners, like what the hell this thing is.
Yeah, yeah,
But we were able to show that, yeah, look, it is happening in these hibernators, and presumably, based on the results we saw, it is benefiting them. It is what we think it's allowing them to emerge from the hibernation season into the spring active season when they mate. It allows them to emerge in good shape. And so this was basically a proof of concept study. So we're at that very early stage. And if you think of, like a lot of, there's what's sometimes called the discovery pipeline in science, which is a spectrum ranging from, say, on one side you have where this study is, which is elucidating, shining a light on some phenomenon in the natural universe. In this case, it was animal physiology and symbiosis between an animal and it's got microbes, but it could be, any realm of the natural sciences. And then at the other end of that spectrum, on the discovery pipeline, you have the application. And sometimes, oftentimes, I would guess, a lot of discoveries do not end up proving to be fruitful or useful to, say, humans or society
at the time, ways. Maybe at the time.
Certainly at the time. Yeah, definitely at the time. I would guess that a lot of what become ubiquitous pieces of technology, for example, were rarely glimpsed by the people who were the discoverers of the natural phenomenon.
It played off something else, and it went back and found it later to be like, oh, this could be useful for this.
Exactly, and I think that's I think that's very interesting. It's a very interesting idea. There's very neat examples of this throughout, modern history, and I think what's neat about it is, I think it requires a different type of, sometimes, depending on the phenomenon in question and the eventual technology, it requires a different person or a different thought process to sort of make the link. So the person who's maybe adept at discovering the natural phenomenon may not have, their mode of thinking about things may not be as amenable to the development or the application or translation of this mechanism to some aspect of the human existence, for example, that may be benefited from it. So it requires the input of different people coming at it from different perspectives. And
that is true, yeah. You can get tunnel vision, right, with certain people, certain frames of thought.
Exactly.
Need an out-of-the-box thinker.
Yeah, exactly. And, sometimes I think out-of-the-box thinkers are the ones who are seen like, that's what maybe is the desirable or seen as like sort of, like the Elon Musk of the world, like the desirable way to approach things.
Yeah.
But the fact is, science requires different. Science is a huge endeavor, and it requires detail-focused people who go super deep on, for example, like a single ion pump in a cell membrane, and they devote their career to studying that and the different subunits that allow it to function.
Yeah, and that's like a key part, and it's a tedious part that a lot of people aren't going to have much interest in.
Exactly.
But there's going to be there's a lot of people that depend on that too for their research and,
Yeah. Yeah, and then so to bring it back in here to urea nitrogen salvage to get around to answering your question, I think that because we're at this early phase, what is going to be required...
Oh, you cut out for a sec there.
Oh, do you have me?
Yeah, you sound distant though for some reason. Did it die?
How are you?
Yeah, it's back.
It's back? Okay.
Yeah. But I just want to speak for a second so that the listeners know. So nitrogen salvage, basically you have the animals that hibernate, like bears and stuff like that, squirrels. And if we were to try to do the same thing, after like a few days, our muscle mass would atrophy. We would, we need to work out constantly. We need to be using our muscles. If we don't use them, we lose them. These animals can go for like months at a time, days, weeks, and not lose any muscle mass. So the idea was like, how can these mammals, go to sleep and rest for long periods of time and not experience atrophy? And so this was the nitrogen salvage theory, that some component of their body is salvaging nitrogen from other parts of their body. So in this case, it's like their urine or, pee to do that. So.
Yeah, exactly. And that's what's also leading to, the possibility, just looking at these animals and what they do over the winter. It's partly that they're completely inactive. The species we work with is inactive for about 6 months because their hibernation season lasts about 6 months. But they're also not eating during that time, so they're not taking in any new nutrients, which is really fascinating because
Yeah.
that combination of inactivity plus no new nutrients coming uh, into the system, into the animal, would, in theory, lead to muscle wasting because as the body starts to
Break itself down.
break itself down to convert its own materials into energy so as to sustain life.
Yeah, to keep the
Um,
vitals going.
exactly, and so these animals they avoid that, and that's been known for a long time. It's one of the really it's kind of the point of hibernation, as an adaptive mechanism. It allows these animals to go throughout a season of the year where there is little to no food available to them. It allows them to survive that and emerge on the other side.
Yeah.
Um,
So, what some of these articles were talking about, into regards to like discovering this, is like how could we take that feature from certain mammals and then apply it to humans? And the benefit to this would be like when we think of space travel and the long endeavors it will take to get to certain places, is maybe this will help us achieve hibernating or like a homeostasis state of being where you know we could make it like far distances without needing like a lot of sustenance. And I don't know, when I think about it, I think of maybe like gene editing through CRISPR, or I don't know. There's that some future technology that's not made yet. Maybe even something as simple as an injection in the future.
yeah, yeah. So I think there's a couple of applications here of hibernation to human space flight, and so the one you're talking about there is lowering the metabolic rate of crew members, astronauts, cosmonauts, whoever,
Mm.
so as to reduce the requirement for consumables, food, water, oxygen, reduce the rate at which CO2 is produced. That reduces up mass, like the mass of the craft as it leaves Earth, which is a significant limiter um,
Yeah.
to, to space flight. There's also some biological, it would also, in theory, reducing metabolism in a highly regulated fashion, similar to hibernators as they do throughout the wintertime. It would simultaneously mitigate some of the biological challenges that come with long duration space flight in deep space, in particular in the full radiation environment outside Earth's Van Allen belts, because uh, one is there is some evidence from the 60s and 70s in studies that were actually funded by NASA that show that hibernating mammals, in fact, the same species that we work with, the 13-line ground squirrel, um, they're highly resistant to ionizing radiation.
That's
And
interesting.
yeah, you can take the same species and you can irradiate them while they're in torpor, which is the name of this metabolically depressed state that they spend most of the hibernation season in. If you blast them with radiation while they're in torpor, their survival rates are significantly better than if you were to blast the same species while they're in the summertime and at their normal metabolic rate. So there appears to be some intrinsic element to torpor, or a reduced rate of metabolism, that is protective when it comes to ionizing
Do
radiation.
do we know why yet or no?
It's not really known why. There are a few hypotheses out there about why it may be. It may be related to temperature, so reduction in temperature. When a hibernator induces this torpid state, their body temperature falls from what is in the summertime 37 degrees, just like us, and it will fall to pretty much the ambient temperature of their surroundings, so their little hibernation burrow, their hibernaculum, which is about 5 degrees Celsius. They keep it slightly above that, maybe 6.5 degrees.
Amazing.
So their body, if you pick one up,
You cut again. You cut again.
okay, sorry about this. Is this okay? Do you
Yeah,
got me?
you're
Yeah,
back. Yeah.
okay. Um, yeah, so they're cold because the, the reason there is that the heat that gets them up to 37 degrees in the summer, which is the same same explanation for why we're at 37 degrees, is their rates of metabolism. So the biochemical metabolism is defined as just the totality of all the chemical reactions occurring in the organism at a given point in time. And all of those chemical reactions are, to some degree or other, so to speak, inefficient. And as a byproduct, they produce heat. And so endothermic animals that maintain their body temperatures at high 30s, low 40s, they've been able to co-opt this inefficiency so as to maintain their body temperature at that high level and maintain some element of stability for their biochemical reactions that occur in their cells. And in contrast, an animal like a fish or an amphibian or a reptile, for the most part, there are exceptions to these, but for the most part, these animals, their body temperature tracks pretty much identically the temperature of their surrounding environment. And so as a result, their chemical reactions, proceed at lower or faster rates depending on the temperature of the environment that they find themselves in. And so the hibernating animal, by lowering its metabolic rate, its body temperature plummets. And there is some evidence to suggest that it is this low temperature that has a protective effect on certain elements of damage to certain molecules like DNA in the cell when it comes to ionizing radiation.
It's amazing how that plays into it. Like another aspect of space travel, though, it's almost like you're sort of deciphering like something that's hitting in like DNA that kind of assist us in like space travel, possibly in the distant future, right? I don't know. It sort of seems like we're solving a puzzle. I don't know.
Yeah,
Sometimes it feels that way.
yeah. So that's kind of that's how I see science in
Yeah.
general. It's sort of like it's a puzzle. Like when if one empties a puzzle onto a table, they know that all the elements are there to put it together and understand whatever the picture is or whatever is on the puzzle.
I'm fascinated by DNA because it's basically a giant puzzle. It's both a computer and a massive storage system, and in that it contains basically every living thing on Earth is like in DNA, and it can basically use that to like evolve, like and process that information into whatever it needs necessary. And in a way, to me, it kind of seems like nanotechnology in a way, or like even smaller, where, like if we were to build a life form, like something like nanotech that we wanted to like use to like seed the universe or monitor the universe, it's like would the most pinnacle of technology, would it be like something similar to DNA? Because like we could send it anywhere in the universe, and if it found a suitable environment over time, it could adapt and evolve to that environment. Possibly. I don't know.
Yeah, well, that is the idea of like evolution by natural selection. It's a phenomenon that it would likely play out if there are certain elements involved. Then it's sort of an automatic consequence. So, for example, if certain traits are heritable, that is passed on from one generation to the next, and if certain numbers of those traits are more likely to lead to survival and or success with reproduction, then the result is that the evolution of the species or whatever the entity is, the DNA containing entity, it will evolve via natural selection in the same process, or via the same process that we've seen organisms here on Earth
Yeah.
evolve over the past few billion years. And the process of the way that DNA is modified is a more or less, for the most part, a random process where you have mutations that occur Most of these mutations are of little to no consequence. Some of them are detrimental and actually lead to decreased rates of survival and or reproduction. And then the ultimate fate of those tends to be, because of natural selection, they get weeded out and are diminished over time in the population. And then another subset of those will actually benefit survival or reproduction. And then so gradually over time, those will become more present in the population. So there is an element of chance, which is the initial mutation, which can be positive, negative, or neutral. And then there's the more directed form, or what's not chance about the process, which is the way that selection acts on it and leads to its either eventual increase in prevalence in the population or its weeding out and loss from the population.
What do you think of things like, I think it's divergent evolution, where you have an animal that's unrelated, but it evolves to look similarly to something else to fill like a ecological niche. So for example, in North America, we have raccoons. And then I guess like in Asia, they have the red panda. They look very similar. They both look, sort of like raccoon-like. And the idea, I guess, is that they're not the same species, and I don't even think they're closely related, but they do look very similar, and they think that that's divergent evolution, if I'm not mistaken. Sorry if I'm getting that wrong, but it's like, they just sort of evolved over time to fulfill that similar ecological niches. Is that sort of like, to me, that almost seems like a blueprint for like DNA or like evolution, where certain conditions, like when exposed to certain conditions or criteria in their environment, it'll just develop like a specific or certain way. I don't know.
Yeah. So I think that's convergent
Oh,
evolution that you're
convergent.
talking.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that's I agree that's a phenomenon that's not gone unnoticed by biologists, because it's a potentially useful system with which to study the mechanisms that allow survival in certain environments. So if you have two, like you say, unrelated species that have evolved similar traits, whether they're physical, traits related to their physical appearance or traits related to some physiological or biochemical process within their bodies or within their cells, if there is some convergence on the same solution to the same problem, then it is a neat example of how evolution works and how it kind of cuts away given enough time. It sort of converges on a similar solution to a similar problem. And what I find neat about this is, and what's kind of at the heart of where I'm taking my research program, is I think it allows someone to glimpse what are the fundamental principles underlying a phenomenon in question. So for example,
Yeah.
I'm interested in metabolic depression, which is like, as I stated earlier, this ability of animals to, in a very regulated fashion, reduce their metabolic rates by significant degrees, and then recover and then revive themselves from those states, and it prolongs their survival in environments that would otherwise be inhospitable. And there are, like I said, these are specialized animals that do this. Most animals cannot do this, but there are many examples of animals that can do it, and they are not necessarily related to one another. And so what I'd like to do with my research program is study these different, relatively unrelated or distantly related groups of animals that employ the same strategy of metabolic depression, and then try and isolate what are the common features or what are the common mechanisms that are present in these different groups. Because if we can understand what those naturally evolved common mechanisms are, then it's probable that they are critical to the safe or effective use of this particular trait of metabolic depression. And I think that if an ultimate goal is to translate this ability to depress metabolism in this way, then I think that a pretty solid understanding of what these fundamental critical components are that have independently evolved separately from one another, but are present in these different groups. I think that's going to be important information because it's probably going to be traits or phenomena that will need to be translated in the process of translating the entire phenotype or the entire trait of metabolic depression to animals that don't naturally induce these states or haven't naturally evolved an ability to induce these states. So it's your example of convergent evolution is it's not only really interesting for the reasons you said, it's actually a really powerful and useful tool when it comes to understanding the phenomenon in question at its basic or first principles level.
I wanted to talk about tardigrades a little bit because they have this pretty unique ability where they can basically shut down all their metabolic functions and they can come back from it, probably more so than any other species, and they can do that through extreme environments as well. So I was doing some reading and I came across some more articles and stuff like that, and there's some speculation that they might be able to facilitate space flight on what's called a wafer. And basically what a wafer is, I don't know if you know, but for the listeners, it's a piece of substrate. It's very light. It's just like a disc. It's small. It's made basically to be able to be propelled on photonic energy or light. So it can be propelled using a laser. And by using that kind of as a propulsion system, you can actually get to in theory, you can get to about 20 to 30% the speed of light, which is probably faster than anything else we could manage, especially relying on traditional fuels. Even nuclear, I don't think we could get that fast. So they estimate that in theory, it would probably take 20 to 30 years to get to the nearest star system, our closest star, Proxima Centauri, I think that's what it is. And when they realized they could get up to a gram of weight onto this piece of substrate, one of the potential candidates for putting something on that piece of substrate was a tardigrade. And they thought, if it can survive pretty harsh conditions, it can go into a state of homeostasis. It seems to be this really good candidate. And then there's certain ideas and ways of tracking its kind of biological functions once it reaches that solar system. I was wondering if you had any thoughts or anything on that, or I don't know if you could speak to it.
Yeah, of course. I love talking tardigrades, space flight. But tardigrades. So this is, tardigrades, I think they have successfully survived in the vacuum of space. So they have this ability, oh yes, the other thing I wanted to talk to you is homeostasis. So let's return to those two things, DNA and then the way you're using the term homeostasis, which is not wrong, but we'll refine it a little bit in a way that I think you'll find interesting. So tardigrades do have this incredible ability to enter states of metabolic depression as a result of different factors of their environment. So basically, when any essential abiotic factor of their environment disappears, whether it's oxygen or heat or water or food, they have an ability to enter this pronounced state of metabolic depression. And just for context, the hibernating mammals I work with, they can depress their metabolism by about 99% in the hibernation season relative to their normal summertime rates of metabolism, which is incredible. Humans, we can depress ours during slow wave sleep, for example, maybe by 10 to 15%. So 99% is incredible. Tardigrades, they can reduce it to 99.99%. So they're essentially turning themselves off.
Yeah.
And they enter states, for example, I think the most pronounced state is when water disappears and they can enter a state what's called anhydrobiosis. That's the name that's given to this metabolic state, where they can stay almost indefinitely. And then once, in this case, water returns to their environment, they will rehydrate relatively quickly and then go about life. as if, as if nothing happened, which is really remarkable and an incredible survival trick. And you can see why natural selection may have selected for that over the last few 100 million years. Now, in terms of sending them on, so another thing is, I think that this ability to enter these states is underlies their ability to have survived in the vacuum of space for some period of time, which most animals, especially us, it's impossible because it's just such a harsh environment in so many ways. So for that reason, I think that if we were to strap, a living organism, an animal, to a wafer or to any spacecraft, then especially if there was no enclosed environment for them to be within, like a habitat, then a tardigrade would be one of our only options, not just a good option, but one of our only options, because most animals or most organisms would not survive that environment. Now, in terms of why we would do that, so sending tardigrades to another star system, like outside our solar system, to another star in the Milky Way galaxy, without the intention to return them to Earth, which would take forever, but let's just assume that propulsion technology was sufficient where that could be done. I don't know why. I guess I'm not sure why one would do that. In fact, I would worry a little bit that it would be unethical to do it, because if for some reason or other, be it a planned reason or an accidental reason, the wafer or the spacecraft was drawn into a gravitational field of some planet and actually was drawn down onto the planet's surface, and then the tardigrades survived re-entry, which is possible for these animals, and then revived if the conditions were sufficient for them on that planet, then that's a huge ethical
because you don't know what kind of terror they're going to bring upon that planet. They might be like the alien invaders of that planet.
Exactly, yeah. And there is this idea of is it targeted panspermia? It's panspermia, but one that is not accidental or the result of natural phenomena.
That's what that would kind of be.
Exactly, yeah. And I don't, that's a to be honest, I haven't dwelled too deeply on that idea, on the ethics of it, but I do know that it is unethical. There are some deep ethical considerations there that I think would need to be discussed by a multidisciplinary group of people before we would engage in that. I know when Musk, in that, if you remember, you probably remember that first Falcon Heavy launch where they released Musk's Tesla Roadster into
the
space.
car.
Yeah, and I don't think that was sterilized. I don't think that they had sterilized the vehicle, and now it's on some like billion-year elliptical orbit around the sun. And I remember at the time just reading on Reddit or wherever some people who brought this up, and that maybe that wasn't a great ethical decision to do that. I mean, it was pretty emotional to see when the fairing opened and that thing flowed out. Yeah. Especially because they were playing Bowie in the live feed and stuff. But
I don't think it'll end up on like a planet with life, though. So I don't know.
Well, what if it ends up on a planet? So what if it ends up on? Let's just assume there were tardigrades along for the ride, and and it does end up on, say, Mars, okay? And say, there's been considerable effort since the 70s to investigate whether life either currently exists or has existed at some point on Mars. Now, what if this is just a question. It's not based on my opinion, but just an interesting discussion. What if that Tesla Roadster accidentally seeded Mars with life, whether they were tardigrades or some other microorganism, on a non-sterilized Tesla Roadster? Even if there is no life on Mars currently, again, there's a Bowie reference in there too.
I think they're planning on messing up Mars as much as they can anyway, so I don't know if they I don't.
It'll just get the terraform going
Yeah,
earlier than planned.
I saw an article the other day where it was like one of the rovers like took a still image shot of some of the trash it left behind. I'm like, well, we already littered the planet. Good job. Like, it's like,
Yeah,
yeah. So I don't know. And if they want to colonize it, I mean, we're bringing our whole, you know, all the bacteria on us with us. So I don't
and
know. I don't. I guess that is an ethical debate. I guess they haven't even thought of that. They jumped the gun on it.
well, like one of the things I like about Elon Musk and about SpaceX, and their mission statement. Like for a mission statement, the goal to colonize, to make humans multiplanetary. It's just almost like it's almost unbelievable that a company that has achieved the success in a relatively conventional way that SpaceX has a mission statement like that. That's still their mission statement. I think that's incredible. I think a lot of people find that
Yeah, it's
incredible.
incredible. It's something to inspire to. Like people have been looking up to the stars since like the beginning of time and just dreaming and like from that we've built like massive structures, pyramids, South America, Egypt, kind of based on the formation of these stars and stuff like that. So a lot of our like ingenuity, a lot of our modern development is in relation to just looking up at the sky and just seeing, and like I guess Mars would look like a star back then, almost until we had the telescope. But yeah, dude, like I don't know. There's a lot to say about space's influence on the human imagination and
Hmm.
desire to kind of learn more. And even like biology, like studying what you're studying, and it's like you can take away what you're learning and what you're discovering and then implementing it into like how can we further that into what's above us. And that's it's crazy to think about a lot of things. Like when you think about like the development of people, like even as little kids, like I don't know about you, but like I was always obsessed with like little rocks and stuff and finding cool looking rocks. And I find that like a lot of kids still have like an obsession with finding cool looking rocks. And then even like as adults and as we develop as a species, like our whole fixation has been a lot on like pulling stuff from the earth and like refining it or turning it into something useful. And that goes into like steel, you know, gunpowder, and then eventually like uranium for like nuclear stuff. And it just seems to be like this driving force that's in our biology. It's kind of weird. It's sort of like it's almost as ingrained in us as reproduction and like eating. I mean, that's kind of a bold statement to say, but human. And then you look at how our technology is developing today, where we're constantly developing better and more cost-effective stuff, and we're just like you look at the internet, cell phones, computers, all that stuff over the past 10, 20, 30 years, it's leaping and bounding. And it kind of seems like I don't know, or is there some sort of hardwiring in humans to like extract Earth and refine it into like technology and then ultimately into this goal to like manifest into space? I don't know. It's kind of an extraordinary claim, but it's also very like it's a good thought experiment I think to think about. It's kind of like what is it about DNA and like I don't know, for people at least, like other living stuff on living organisms on earth don't really seem to be programmed that way. It could just be like a sociological thing completely or cultural, but yeah, I don't know. I'm just fascinated by it.
Yeah, it could be too that we so rather it could just be a manifestation of our resourcefulness, which could be itself a product of our intellect, which has been, one of the. I mean, there are different hypotheses on this, but our intellect, as a species, our intellect has served us well, and some believe has been selected for directly, and the result being that we have become intelligent to the point that we have with,
Yeah.
and that has resulted in manifestation of things like consciousness, perhaps. Although again, different theories depending on who you talk to about what exactly consciousness
Yeah,
is.
that's a
But
massive rabbit hole.
It is, yeah. But I think resourcefulness. I mean, we've been your example of we have this innate. It seems like we have an innate capacity to extract from the earth, refine whatever it is that we've extracted, and put it to good use. It's true. It could be related specifically to the earth, or it could just be that we are earthbound organisms for the most part, and those are the resources that are available to us. In fact, they're really some of the only resources that have been available to us for the longest time, since before we were, an airfaring and spacefaring civilization in particular. So it could just be that those were the elements that were available to us, and being resourceful, we used them and put them and ended up putting them to use. Uh, and how that ties in with our future in space, I don't know, but it could be. There's a lot of evidence over the evolution of our species that there has been some percentage of our population at all times that seems to be driven to explore. And that's not, it's probably not the majority of people, but there is enough individuals that allow us, the population to spread out slowly from where we first evolved. And, we've reached a point in our spread across the earth, perhaps, and perhaps more relevantly, we've reached a point where we can actually develop technology that can take us from this planet and into space, and then maybe eventually to Mars. Hopefully, humans will. In our lifetime, it would be awesome to see if that actually comes to fruition. But I don't know if it's a.
Yeah,
I don't know if it's a destiny or if it's a fate. I don't know if I believe it's a destiny or fate thing so much as it's just a manifestation of the evolutionary path that our species has gone down, or has not taken, because I don't want to say it was a conscious choice of us to have gone down this evolutionary path, but the one that has been selected for by natural selection.
Have you heard the saying? I forget who said it, but it's like we are like the caterpillar giving birth to like the technological butterfly, or like the, I don't know, like AI, I guess, would be like the ultimate like development of technology, or like AGI. It's sort of like, is technology our highest form of evolution? Like, is that our kind of like grand track, like our ultimate, is that where we end up at as a species? Possibly, or, I don't know.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, so I don't know, but let's explore it here, Ian.
Yeah. Well, yeah, we don't have the answers. But.
I'm not sure who said that quote, but the idea of the metamorphosis of a caterpillar into a butterfly, that's the same individual, right? So if we apply that idea to our species, then what is the technology that we are metamorphosizing, that we are developing, that will be an extension of ourselves, such that it can, just like the butterfly is the same individual as the caterpillar.
Yeah.
The technology is an extension of us. And you mentioned AGI, AI, and then eventual AGI.
Yeah.
That, there is especially with the development of neural nets and things like this, that will perhaps connect our consciousness and our thoughts, our ability to interact with the internet. That seems like there's some analogy in there somewhere with the caterpillar and the butterfly.
So I think AGI, at least initially, its total intelligence will just be like a collective sum of like all of humanity's knowledge, and then I guess it goes from there, and it takes the
Goes from there.
brains, yeah,
Exactly.
and
And
then it
then who
starts
knows?
crushing calculations and solving certain issues and complex equations, and then it's who knows what it's doing after that, what it's solving, what it's doing. Um, yeah, I don't know. It's fascinating to think about, but then I also kind of turn it back in on itself, and it's like if we were to make like a self-replicating robot that could go somewhere throughout the stars where we can't, because I'm not entirely sure we ever will be. When you look at like the distances of these locations, I feel like any kind of like manned crew, if we could do it, by the time it reached its location, because of relativity, like the Earth would basically cease to exist or be like a very different place from when that first crew left. And it's hard to say whether, you know, it continues to exist in the same way. So would the best solution be a technological organism, or would it be a biological organism? You know, like maybe we're sending DNA on a substrate, and you know that's how we're basically making these connections throughout the universe.
Yeah, well, there are lots of people who think that robots are best served for this purpose, for space exploration, partly for reasons that you say, partly for ethical reasons. Um, I guess the only thing, we're talking interstellar distances. I agree that interstellar, it's hard to fathom. Like, it's a conscious effort to fathom what these distances are between even stars in our own arm of the Milky Way galaxy, let alone intergalactic distances, which are pretty much unfathomable. Like they're just so huge and vast
Yeah.
that the idea of humans, unless there is, using anything that is remotely possible today, like propulsion technologies, it's not possible.
It's not possible.
There would have to be the development of which have been, many smart people and writers have written about this in various realms of science fiction and stuff about, how one may traverse these distances. But until the development of, our ability to transit wormholes or whatever it may be, humans, it's not practical. I don't think it's very practical. And so then robots, perhaps it's an easier decision to send a robot or two. But then for what end? Like, ideally, they communicate, like there's something in it for humanity in terms of what we learn, or because the idea wouldn't just be to send them out there, send them to
What's
Proxima Centauri or something.
So here's the thing: what's the ultimate goal of humans colonizing different parts of the solar system, universe, galaxy, whatever? What's the ultimate goal of that? What's the ultimate purpose of that?
Well, so I guess if your question was not what's the ultimate goal of colonizing, but what's the ultimate goal of exploring, then it could be, someone might say, to colonize, that the goal is to colonize, to find somewhere else to live. Someone else may say that the goal of exploring is not colonization, but is to learn about our environment, the natural environment in which, like I look around as a biologist, I look around the environment around me on Earth here and the living organisms that inhabit it, and try and better understand them because I'm curious about them, and not necessarily because I want to co-opt what they have evolved for my own good, but just because I have an innate curiosity about those sorts of things. And it could be the same for those same reasons. And that has driven a lot of like a lot of our exploration of space thus far has been purely curiosity driven. It's not been, to find some new source of raw materials for manufacturing, or a potentially habitable environment that we can use as a, you know, as a backup hard drive.
I
and
I think
and
it might be also the preservation of life. Like it's sort of like into our core programming as a species to like kind of like procreate, reproduce. It's like we know that Earth is finite and it's not going to last forever, and we're seeing like you know we're seeing the end before it happens, and we're just thinking, okay, so how do we prevent this? How do we continue the species after Earth? And I think maybe that's a part of it. So some of it might be just to spread, like, I guess, human consciousness throughout the universe. But I think because of how, unless we can develop new technologies, wormhole, whatever it is, or propulsion, I think it might be like we we might have to defer it to or settling for something smaller and be like, okay, potentially this over time will evolve into something akin to a human. It'll take a very long time, but if we send it everywhere, at least then over time, maybe like a human subspecies, or, like a Soviet or Neanderthal, like there's different ways something similar to a human can sort of take shape. And
mm,
maybe, I don't know, maybe that's like sort of like the goal would be to like spread it that way. I don't know. I'm not sure. Like,
yeah, if the goal is to preserve some aspect of, yeah, I think that's a really narcissistic thing, though, in my opinion, because it's, like I guess there is part of me, like I would be sad to know if for some reason I was given the information that all of humankind will be lost, and everything that humankind had accomplished over its however many years of existence will be lost. That's a sad idea,
it
and
is.
and I think I can see how that can motivate people to be like, well, let's try and avoid that then. Like if we can, let's try and avoid it. But if the answer to avoiding it is just blasting our genomes out with, it's not just the DNA. There needs to be DNA is for, I guess an analogy might be, if we blasted a hard drive out into space, the data, and we preloaded the hard drive with whatever data we wanted to make known somewhere else in the universe. There needs to be a power source
Yeah.
wherever that landed, right? And so, to stick with this analogy, there needs to be a mechanism by which energy can be harnessed from the environment and used so as to replicate the DNA that was present on the wafer, whatever the craft was that had been blasted out into space. But let's assume that that's the case, okay? Which is that's a non-trivial assumption, but we'll assume it. It comes back to this idea of the ethics of doing something like this, and especially if it's sort of a blind shot, like we're just going to blast it somewhere towards maybe a star system. Now we have this interesting information because of Kepler and now James Webb. These space telescopes that have revealed incredible information about like what may be possible in terms of other star systems harboring life as we know it, or environments that may be suitable for life as we know it. And so I guess it wouldn't just be a blind shot, but it would be aimed at the very least, somewhere where there might be a chance.
Yeah, they think it's like an Earth-like planet.
Exactly.
Yeah.
In the Goldilocks zone, not too close, not too far from its star, and all the different elements of the Drake equation. If you're familiar with the Drake equation,
Yeah.
so it's it could be a targeted effort, but it's still pretty. This is a huge ethical quandary, in my opinion. And what right do we have, especially if we are not the only uh, uh,
It would be.
intelligent entities in the universe, which is to say,
Yeah.
especially if the universe is not ours and ours alone, which I believe to be the case, that we are not, that there are other intelligent entities in the universe. it just seems like,
If
speaking statistically,
yeah,
I'm
if
sure
you
you
crush
agree
the
with that.
numbers, yeah,
Yeah.
there is probably some and if not intelligent, at least biologically living, or like
Yeah,
to
you're
our
right.
standard
Yeah.
of living. Yeah.
It doesn't even have, you're right. It doesn't even have to be intelligent. It just has to be, which is far, far more likely, like the rare earth hypothesis, which is that simple, for lack of a better phrase, simple life, like something akin to bacterial or microbial, is quite prevalent in the universe. But the evolution of intelligence is a rare thing. And that may be the case. That's probably more likely to be the case. But even if it was even if we were the only intelligent civilization in the universe, but there were these other life forms akin to bacteria, it's still not our universe. And so to be blasting our contents all over the universe with the hope of them seeding some other habitable environment and then proliferating there, I think is it, I, I I don't know if I'd be in favor of that. But
Yeah, there's a lot of variables.
a lot of variables there, yeah, and a lot of potential resonance for others that is hard to predict at the outset, you know. But presumably, if anything like that were to happen, there'd be teams of people thinking about this, people far more intelligent than me, and trying to ponder just what the ramifications to something like this might be.
Now,
The other thing could be just, doing something like going to a planet where, like Mars, where, uh, as far as we know, there is currently no life there, and so it's also close, and it's plausible that, um, in certain ways, that it could become habitable, uh, and that could potentially, it won't avoid the fate, the ultimate fate of our species, of our planet, which is to be engulfed by the sun, because that that will get Mars too.
yeah.
Maybe a little later, perhaps, but it would inevitably get Mars too. But it would avoid certain fates that could befall humanity on Earth, such as an asteroid impact or something like that, which is sort of at the heart of when you hear Musk and SpaceX, talk about this with respect to SpaceX's the mission statement for SpaceX. It's often in that
What do,
context.
what do you think's more likely to happen first? That we terraform Mars, or we decide to start gene editing humans to make them um, better able to survive the environments of Mars? Sort of like a forced evolution.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, right now that's ethically probably not going to happen, but if we look hundreds of years into the future, maybe even thousands, and sort of like, and humans continue on the same trajectory that they're on, I feel like they may have the technology by then to sort of gene edit a human to different environments. It seems very sci-fi to say something like that because there's not really a whole lot of groundwork for that, but we do have things like CRISPR, sort of like being able to like select the eye color, hair color, remove certain hereditary ailments. It's like, how long down the road of, do we start adding in things that aren't really unnatural to human, like evolution?
Yeah, and then how does that compare to terraforming in terms of time?
Yeah, would it be
Time scale?
easier or harder in time
Well,
scales? Like,
yeah, I guess, so part of me thinks we're already capable of gene editing, like you say, with the CRISPR-Cas9 system. And it is being used in certain contexts to edit the genomes of humans, um, and it's being refined in other organisms. I think currently it's being used primarily for single gene. It's to remedy single gene ailments.
stuff they know.
Of stuff they know that involve single genes. I think when it comes to more complex phenotypes or traits that require the involvement of more than one gene, then that just makes the process more complex. But that's we're already on uh, the advancement in that technology over the past 10 years since the Doudna paper in 2012, it's been incredible. And so I think that's going to continue to advance. The technology will continue to advance at a very high rate, and probably just faster and faster as more people get on board, and some results, or more and more results of this technology in terms of how it can be used for good, um, become available. What may lag uh, is the ethical, uh, our obligations ethically to use this technology. So I think the technological development is is developing at a high rate currently, will continue to do so, but the way that we ethically employ this technology will slow the rate at which it's applied, and reduce the number of um, contexts in which it's used, perhaps. But we're on the way to doing it. So I think that it's like the technological capability to do it is here. So to answer your question about gene editing versus terraforming, um, just because we can do it already, I would guess gene editing. I mean, I guess terraforming could be as simple as, sending a thermonuclear warhead and blasting it over one of the poles.
That's
And
the first thing we do.
exactly, and then just enriching the environment with CO2, and that's all it would take. And we probably have that. Well, we have the thermonuclear technology available to us, and presumably it could be sent uh, into Martian orbit to do something like that. Again, there are ethical considerations there,
Yeah.
but
The thing that causes the destruction of Earth is what seeds life on Mars. Wouldn't that be ironic?
yeah, there's some deep
Poetry
deep
there.
irony there. But I guess the thing is, and so to draw the link between these two, as you did at the beginning, there is, can gene editing be used to make the human species more adapted to life on Mars? And so it's not just gene editing you're talking about, but the application of gene editing with the goal of making us more capable of living a normal life on Mars as we know Mars to be right now without terraforming. And whether
Yeah.
that will come quicker than terraforming Mars. I don't know. I think that we're at a relatively early stage of our the ways in which CRISPR can be used, and the types of um, traits that it can alter. Uh, like I said, mostly from what I understand, I don't use CRISPR, so I'm not an expert on this, but um, as a biologist, just understanding a little bit about how it works, it's being used mostly for single gene,
Yeah. It's
for
in its
editing single
infancy.
genes.
It's in its
Exactly.
infancy, yes.
And so but when it's scaled up to be used in for more complex traits that are coded by various genes, like multiple genes, then I guess,
Maybe sky's the limit. I don't
uh,
know.
as an optimist, I'd say sure, but there are some pretty major uh,
Breakthroughs that they would have to have before
yeah,
they can really.
the obstacles of life on Mars without any sort of habitat
Yeah, you're
are
already
like
thinking of.
profound.
Yeah,
Yeah.
because you're
So,
thinking of an organism that would have to like not breathe oxygen, and that's not really found on Earth. So
yeah, there'd have to be some element of terraforming, I think, to make life on Mars possible without life being lived primarily in a habitat, or in
yeah,
a portable habitat like a spacesuit. But in that terraforming process, as far as I know, reading Kim Stanley Robinson, is that the author who wrote like Red Mars, Green Mars, Blue Mars? I don't know if you know those books, but
yeah.
anyway, it's a long process to terraform the planet, it seems like. So
Do
I
you,
guess to answer your question, I would guess gene editing, but we're still a long way from
there's
being able
still a
to
long way to
edit the
do that too.
genome
Yeah,
such that, yeah, it
that's why
could
I said
result in,
hundreds, maybe thousands of years. Because,
yeah.
but yeah, I don't know. It's an interesting prospect to think about. to kind of, I don't know, I call it a thought experiment because it's sort of like a daydream to think about aspects and technologies that don't exist and if they can or ever will. And I don't know. I like having an imagination about that stuff. It's, I don't know.
Well, I
It's
think it's useful. It's interesting and it's useful, right? Like it's good to, um, people imagining stuff like this is probably where the seeds for a lot of important developments and uh, ideas came from.
yeah.
So
So what's your, do you have like, I think I already touched on this earlier, but like, what's your next big project, or what's your overarching, like, do you have like something you really want to work on in the future that may not be happening right now, but maybe one day you will?
yeah, so I want to. I guess the short term, what I'm doing in the short term here is I'm working on a couple of projects. So one of them is related to this study that was just the study that we just published in Science that we've been talking about urea nitrogen salvage. And um, what we're going to be doing is looking at what specific proteins within the hibernating animal are being synthesized with the help of this microbe-dependent process. So just quickly to put that in a bit of context, the the benefits that we saw of this nitrogen salvage process, the benefits that we saw for the hibernators manifested in their ability to synthesize new protein during the hibernation season when they were not eating, which means not taking in a source of nitrogen, which is the key atomic building block in proteins, and they were not exercising, which meant that their muscles in particular were prone to wasting. And so we found that this process of urea nitrogen salvage, which uses their gut microbes, it's a gut microbe dependent process, to salvage the nitrogen that's present in the urea molecule, which usually gets peed out.
Yeah.
In this case, it gets shifted into the intestines, where it's in the presence of certain microbial species that can break that urea into its component parts, liberate that nitrogen, and then that nitrogen can be absorbed and then used by the hibernator to build new protein when they don't have any other source of nitrogen. So it's a really elegant system for making use of what is usually a waste product. So what we want to find, we found in this study that nitrogen that urea-derived nitrogen is being used to build new proteins, but we didn't know, and we don't yet know, which proteins in particular it's being used to build
So that's
in
the
the
next step.
tissues. So that's the next step, yeah, and the reason this is interesting. So this is work that will be funded by the Canadian Space Agency, and one of the space flight angle on this, or why it's relevant to space flight, is because we've known since the 60s that space, being in the microgravity environment of space, reduces load on the muscles, so the amount that muscles exercise,
Yep.
because we're usually always, like you and I, where we are right now, our postural muscles are fighting against gravity to keep us sitting or standing. And when one's in a microgravity or zero gravity environment, that constant load is not acting on the muscles, and so muscles quickly atrophy, and that's why astronauts and cosmonauts, spaceflight crew members, need to exercise so intensively while they're in space, is to reduce the rate at which their muscles shrink. So one of the reasons the muscles shrink is because the synthesis of new protein is slowed. The rates at which new proteins are built in the muscles are reduced in space. And we actually know, based on proteomic studies, which proteins in particular are reduced. There's many of them, but there's essentially a list that we can look at based on studies that have been conducted aboard the International Space Station. And so what we're going to do is we're going to look at, well, what proteins is this process that we're seeing in the hibernators, which is a sort of similar a similar state, in not metabolic state, but a similar state in terms of a lack of activity leading to muscle wasting. What proteins is this urea nitrogen salvage being used to build in the hibernators? Because if there's an overlap between the proteins that this process is facilitating the synthesis of in hibernators and the proteins that are being lost or not synthesized during spaceflight, then it gives it provides further evidence that this whole process of urea nitrogen salvage could be potentially beneficial as a countermeasure to microgravity in space, and help the synthesis of proteins that are usually not synthesized during space flight.
Yeah, that would be huge.
Yeah,
What,
so
what,
that's I'm excited. I'm excited to do this project.
yeah, that it's super cool that it's being funded by the, Canadian Space Program. But how do you see it being in the future? What possible applications do you think, like, how could it be used on people? Do you see it as like sort of like an injection maybe of like these proteins? Maybe it'll be, I don't know, something you drink. Will it require something else? Like,
Hmm.
I don't know. Or is that too far down the
No,
road?
no,
Or
no. We can. I mean, I don't. It's probably too early to say with certainty, but it's we can talk about what it might look like. So, like I said, this is a gut microbe dependent process,
yeah,
because it requires, so that urea that in in my research case the squirrels are producing, but in our case we produce urea as well as the main
yeah,
components in our urine. Uh, Animals or vertebrates do not have, are not able to produce an enzyme called urease, which is the tool that breaks urea into its component parts. So none of us have the genes for it. No squirrel, no human.
okay,
But certain microbial species do have the genes to build this urease enzyme, which, like I said, can split urea into its component parts. So uh, the simplest way that this could possibly work is to seed the gut microbiome of humans, like spaceflight crew members, for example, with some of these microbial species so as to increase the number of microbes in their intestines that are capable of breaking urea into its component parts. And then once you break it into its component parts, that nitrogen is free to be absorbed and then potentially used to synthesize new proteins. So it could be as simple as what is essentially a probiotic or a prebiotic treatment for humans. Now, it's very likely to be far more complex than that, just for a couple of reasons. First is the microbial environment of the intestines is highly complex, and so it's not as easy as just dumping in a new player into that environment and expecting everything to be fine after that.
correct.
There are often downstream effects that may have negative consequences on gastrointestinal health or inflammation or something like that. So of course that needs to be this would have to be tested step by step to make sure that this could be done in a safe way. The second thing is this process of urea nitrogen salvage, although it really does rely on these gut microbes, it involves 4 or 5 other really important steps. And so if for some reason humans were incapable of any of those other steps, then in theory, we could load the intestines with as many of these urealytic microbes, they're called, as we wanted, and there would be no actual urea nitrogen salvage because the mechanisms or the architecture for these other steps are not present. So we have to have each of these different steps for this whole process to actually work and result in the synthesis of new proteins using this urea nitrogen. But
Yeah.
what's encouraging is there are studies that were done in the 90s that show that humans are capable of urea nitrogen salvage under certain conditions. It's not as effective or as prominent as it is in the hibernating mammals that we look at, but it looks like we are capable of doing it, which
Oh,
suggests that
interesting.
we have the architecture or the machinery in place at these different steps. It may just need to be optimized. So we may need
Yes.
to go in there, understand how these hibernators are doing this, themselves naturally, and then with that information we can potentially optimize how we're using this process, and particularly under certain situations such as spaceflight, or under conditions of, for example, on Earth, like conditions of undernourishment, a hallmark of which is low amounts of dietary nitrogen, for example, or long periods of bed rest, which is similar to hibernation and spaceflight in that muscles atrophy pretty quickly when one is confined to a hospital bed because of a coma or what have you. So if we can understand these mechanisms that allow the hibernators at each of these different steps to increase the rate that they use this, which they do. That was one of the things we found, is that unlike most processes in hibernation, this one actually increases over the hibernation season. So they amplify their ability to use it. And if we can understand how they amplify their ability to do it, then we may be able to translate some of those mechanisms to humans and amplify our own abilities to use it.
It's fascinating that it's in basically that study in the 70s confirms more or less that it's at least within the human genome that, that nitrogen salvage. So I feel like it's a good indicator it's a good indicator in that we will be positively responsive to this technique. Yeah.
Yeah, I think so. I think that, as long as we take it step by step, and, before, we won't just be, we wouldn't just be going straight to humans with this. We'd be trying it in other animals that have similar gastrointestinal architectures as we have, for example, and taking it step by step. But I do see this as plausible, and
it's plausible. It's not like we're trying to teach us how to like photosynthesize or something.
Exactly. Yeah. And I think that the question will be not so much whether we are capable of this, but just how beneficial it will be to those situations that I said. So spaceflight, for example, or to bed rest, or to undernourishment.
Yeah,
just
there's a ton of applications now that I'm thinking about it.
Yeah, and I think that these earthbound, a lot of people over the past few weeks when I've been talking to people about this since the study was published, people are very interested in the spaceflight applications, which, like I totally understand, and I'm a huge, well, as you can see here, I'm a biologist, but I'm also a big space enthusiast. But if I were to bet, or if I were to guess, it would be, if this technology is developed and translated to humans, it will be for reasons like the primary drivers will be earthbound reasons. Its application to earthbound problems such as undernourishment or bed rest before spaceflight.
Correct.
Partly because there's just so many more people who are affected by undernourishment and bed rest. Another one's sarcopenia, actually, which affects all of us as we age, like the gradual muscle wasting that sets in after around 40 years of age.
Yeah.
So it just affects all of us. And if you compare that to the relatively few number of people who are in space at any given time, it's like just a numbers game. It's like, well, the benefits, there seems to be higher return on investment by applying this to earthbound situations.
Yeah, that's where the revenue will come from, to fund the more extravagant things.
Exactly. And because it will be invariably more difficult, just like everything is, to execute this process in the environment of a spacecraft, especially if it's a spacecraft, in transit to Mars or something that's relatively isolated, like something aboard the ISS that's relatively close, and in an emergency situation, people can be, it's a different thing when one is in deep space and with on a 9-month journey towards Mars, for example.
Like, I think of quality of life for people with cancer. Like they'll see a deterioration of their muscle mass because more prone to being bedridden and stuff like that. But cancer is a very pervasive thing. It's like the number one killer in Canada, and to have like sort of like that used as a quality of life treatment, while they're going through stuff like radiation or chemo to sort of keep their muscles. If there's a lot of other variables before, I'm jumping to conclusions here, but I'm seeing a lot of positives to this sort of the work you're doing. Like just like thinking off the top of my head, a bunch of different things. I can also possibly see maybe military applications depending on now. What if you don't need to protect against like atrophy? What if you're fully fit? And it's like it ends up being a way to make people stronger, like increases muscle mass, like maybe something similar to like how like anabolic steroids function on humans, and then you're using that to, I don't know, benefit like soldier durability or something.
Yeah.
Or yeah, there's a whole bunch of different, I like the word spirals from. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think like as I was mentioning that discovery pipeline earlier, we're still at this discovery of a natural phenomenon end of the pipeline. And I think at this, as we move towards any potential application of this, it's going to be important to understand whether or not this actually has the potential to be useful in those different situations. And I'm excited for that. Like that's at the heart of this grant with the Canadian Space Agency, is to understand, okay, let's take a first step. In theory, this could potentially benefit muscle protein synthesis in microgravity, but it's just theoretical at this point. So let's take a step towards, accumulating some evidence to suggest, oh no, it actually might, because there's this overlap of proteins that seem to be benefited by this system or this process, which are not synthesized in a spaceflight environment, for example. And I think equally important will be to determine relatively early on in this process whether it's not beneficial, whether it's not likely to be beneficial, so that there is minimal time and energy and resources put towards something that ultimately will not prove to be useful. So that's sort of the other side of the coin when I'm thinking about how I might develop projects to explore the translational potential for this system. It's, be mindful of not just indicators of its potential benefits, but also indicators of its potential, the opposite, like uselessness towards certain applications, so that we don't waste time and money on something.
Correct. Yeah, that's a good point. I guess, we've been talking for over an hour now. I think it's a good time to wind it down, unless you have like a couple things you just wanted to get out there before we shut her down.
No, I think at one point I mentioned I wanted to return to homeostasis.
Yeah.
Yeah, so just you can choose whether to include this or not. But so homeostasis, correct me if I'm wrong, but how I interpreted your use of homeostasis was something equivalent to a state of metabolic depression.
I thought it was like a state beyond that.
Yeah, so it's a state that is.
I was sort of using them interchangeably, but what I meant was, so metabolic depression was like stage 1, and then like the next, like back, like obviously at some point, if you want to get to space travel, you'd probably need something more than that to go vast distances. So that would be like homeostasis, which is
okay.
Yeah. Sorry, I wasn't clear on that, but
that's okay. So what homeostasis? A more refined way to look at homeostasis is, it's just it's the maintenance of a stable environment within a living organism, particularly within the cells of a living organism. And it is essential for life. And by that I mean, once cells start to drift away from homeostasis. So for example, once ion concentrations within the cells, which are very tightly regulated, very highly controlled, once they start to drift away from that homeostatic level, then certain processes, certain biochemical processes within the cells are no longer able to function. And
Yeah,
once critical functions within the cells are no longer able to work properly,
it
then the
dies.
cell dies, and then ultimately the organism dies. So this idea of maintaining a stable environment, which is what homeostasis is essential for life. And it's where virtually all of the energy that we obtain from our environment and then convert and then use in our cells, it goes towards maintaining this stable environment so that everything can function properly. And what's interesting, how this ties in with metabolic depression, is um, this is a highly energetically expensive process to maintain homeostasis. So when an animal lowers its metabolic rate by a vast degree, like a hibernator or like the tardigrades we talked about earlier, it's just such an incredible feat that it is able to maintain that homeostatic environment within its cells, even when it's not using much energy to do so. The fact that its metabolic rate, for example, is lowered by 99% in hibernators means that it's using 99% less energy, which is helpful because when there's no food to be eaten, it means it can go, proportionately longer without eating food because it doesn't need the energy. But to maintain homeostasis under those conditions of low energy use is truly remarkable, and it's one of the reasons why humans cannot enter these metabolic states naturally, because we are unable, if our use of energy falls off anywhere close to something like that, our cells are not able to maintain a state of homeostasis, and then they die. And then once certain critical tissues start dying and organ systems start dying, then the organism itself dies. And so what separates a usable and effective state of metabolic depression from one that is not, and is really just a slow cascade towards death, is this ability to maintain homeostasis the whole way down and then the whole way back up to normal metabolic rate, if you know what I mean.
Do you think like a big contributor to that might be our brains, and that maybe it's like even like our consciousness, and perhaps like because we would be dreaming, or our brain function is just so high and uses so much energy and calories, maybe in comparison to a squirrel or a bear, that it wouldn't be like maybe it wouldn't sustain it or something.
Yeah, well, so if you look at the total amount of energy in an organism, like in a squirrel, for example, that is being consumed by, or let's take a human, that's being consumed by the brain or the nervous system in general. There's a huge, it depends on the activity that the person's currently doing, but a huge percentage goes to supporting the function of the nervous system, the central and peripheral nervous system. And I can't recall the ratios of the nervous system relative to, the mass of the nervous system relative to the mass of the body in general. Or in total, I would guess that it's higher in humans than it is in squirrels. But even in squirrels, a significant portion of the energy that they use on a daily basis goes towards supporting the function of their nervous system as well. So that is something that needs to be dialed down considerably to save energy, because just dialing that down on its own can save a significant amount of energy. But the problem with that is then the central nervous system is like it's the processing facility for basically everything in the body. So there are certain regions of the brain that need to keep functioning so as to sustain life even in that deeply depressed metabolic state. And what's interesting, I was talking earlier about this idea of, when you mentioned convergent evolution, and I talked about how I'd like to harness this idea of convergent evolution to illuminate fundamental principles of metabolic depression in different groups of animals that have independently evolved the ability to induce metabolic depression. And so looking across different animals that do this, if freshwater turtles are capable of deep states of metabolic depression, and so are certain species of fish. And it's known from studies that at the neurological level, they employ different strategies. So the turtle basically shuts off it goes into a coma like state where it's completely unresponsive to external stimuli for the most part.
Appears dead.
It appears dead, yeah, and it's unresponsive. Whereas the fish, which lowers its metabolic rate to approximately the same level, maybe not quite as low as the turtle, but it stays responsive. It's not as responsive as it is when it's at its normal metabolic rate. Certain processes shut down, but it is for the most part responsive to external stimuli, and so it shows that this ability to, all else being equal, if there's differences in the neural the roles that the nervous systems play in these two states of metabolic depression and in the potential for cognition, if thinking about how this might be adapted to humans, what sort of cognitive state humans may need to be may find themselves in if put in an induced state of metabolic depression. But there's nothing saying that a human, if this is ever applied to humans, and the induction of deep states of metabolic depression, there's nothing saying it needs to be like so profoundly depressed at like the hibernator 99% level. Even depressing metabolic rate by 20 or 30%, which is far more feasible and likely to be far less likely to cause irreversible damage to organ systems. Even that relatively modest state of metabolic depression can be hugely beneficial in certain biomedical scenarios and even in spaceflight scenarios. So there's nothing saying that to apply this to humans that it needs to be at this really profound level.
It doesn't have to be at the top of it. It could even just be like a small margin.
Exactly.
Just whatever makes it. I guess there would have to be studies done to see, what's the gain for certain percentages of it.
Exactly, like cost benefit analysis.
Yeah, exactly. That's it. Yeah.
Yeah.
I love it, man. I love the research you're doing. I love that it's getting attention. I think it maybe deserves a little bit more, hence like the podcast. But it's fascinating. Like obviously the romantic stuff about it is space. That's like the stuff we like to imagine about, dream about. But then the practical applications for, earthbound stuff, that's super important. And it's going to probably reduce the amount of suffering in the world by like a significant amount, even if it's a tiny bit, like, just making someone's quality of life a little bit better, or if it's, reducing or increasing somebody's lifespan maybe a slightly bit longer. It reduces a little bit more suffering that people go through, right? And that's unavoidable, but it's a good thing you're doing, and I'm happy that you're doing it.
No, that's very, very kind of you to say, and thank you very much for that. I'm glad that you're interested in it, and that I appreciate you giving me the opportunity to chat with you today.
I appreciate you coming on the show. Like, thank you for doing this. You didn't have to, and I'm forever grateful that you have. I guess all. It's been a pleasure talking to you. I look forward to doing it maybe sometime in the future when you have more to talk about in regards to your work and research.
All right, I will happily do so.
Okay, cheers.